Hello and welcome to the second episode of a Young Fabian Webcast. This week I'll be speaking to Nathan Sparks. Nathan is a young Fabian, he's one of us. He's also the parliamentary manager for Hacked Off, which is a campaign for free and accountable press. So we'll be speaking all things IPSO, press regulation, John Whittingdale. Do enjoy. So early in the EU referendum we saw the headline from The Sun that the Queen backs Brexit. This was false and it was upheld by IPSO as being false. Do you believe, in your opinion, that the press has had a bias towards leaving the EU? And if so, do you think it will have an influence on the overall result of the referendum?
Well, it's difficult to predict. The amazing thing about the Queen backs Brexit story was that although it was clearly an open and shut case in which the content of the story clearly didn't support the headline, clearly a breach of the editor's code, it took IPSO 8 weeks to even reach that conclusion. And then when it did, there was no correction, no apology. All that the Sun had to do was print a tiny adjudication inside the paper. And although obviously this is always, whenever this happens, and it happens all the time with IPSO, they've never given a correction and adjudication due prominence for a code breach. But it highlights how much of an effect poor regulation of the press has on our democracy when it's over such an important issue, such as EU membership, with a public referendum coming up, that just a few months before that, the Sun can get away with printing a hugely misleading splash front page story, and then the correction is just buried inside and is no more than an adjudication, and the number of people who will see the front page it way outweighs the small number of people who will ever even read that adjudication. And you just think about the kind of effect that has on our democracy, and perhaps it will have an effect on the referendum result.
Do you think IPSO itself is going far enough to ensure that the press is regulated, or is it, as the director of Hacked Off has called it, just the PCC with lipstick?
It's certainly no improvement whatsoever on the PCC, and that IPSO ruling is just one example. I mean, there's many. You could look at there's a splash front page story about Jeremy Corbyn taking money from the Privy Council in October time, I think it was, which again was clearly incorrect, clearly a breach of the editor's code. And yet, again, the remedy of it was so tiny in comparison to the front page code breach, the front page story. The adjudication was so small, and not even on the front page either. They only had a tiny reference to it on the front page. And clearly, the IPSO has gone no way to improving press behaviour whatsoever.
The court Jesda headline.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
So anyone who followed the hacking scandal, slightly aside from the Sun, they realised that there was a huge intrusion and a mass number of politicians, celebrities who were being hacked and had been intruded by the press. What's your answer for those who can't afford to pay for arbitration?
So the system as it stands now is that those who can afford to take newspapers to court over libel claims still have access to justice. They could have done so before, and they can do so now. What Leveson recommended was that proper regulators in the future that are genuinely independent and effective should offer low-cost arbitration, which would be much cheaper than taking newspapers to court, and would mean access to justice for anyone who's been libelled by the press. So you look at the stories of people like the McCanns and Christopher Jeffries. Plenty of people who are libelled in the press are not mega wealthy and cannot afford to go through the courts to clear their name. And that's why arbitration was such an important part of what Leveson recommended. Now, Leveson, of course, also recommended that for those newspapers who were refusing to sign up to a proper regulator which offered arbitration as part of that, those newspapers were essentially denying members of the public access to justice who had legal claims against them. So what he said was that for those newspapers who refused to sign up to proper regulation and offer arbitration, those newspapers should have to cover the legal costs of claimants when taking them to court in future. So this would guarantee access to justice for anyone who's been affected by libel in the press. The flip side of it is that arbitration is actually a lot cheaper for newspapers as well.
Yeah.
So local publishers and smaller publishers who sign up to a proper, independent and effective Leveson compliant regulator, they would also, under the Leveson system, they would also get have their costs protected in court, and they would be able to force claimants to go through the route of arbitration rather than the court route.
Does not low arbitration open the door for mass rates of vexatious claims?
So this incentive, this piece of legislation, it does include a clause, it does include a provision for the judge to make a different award of costs to cover that and deal with that. But the point about Section 40 in this piece of legislation, that although it was recommended by Leveson and endorsed by the Prime Minister, and in fact enacted under the last government, with the support of the last government eventually, it's still not being commenced by this government. So as people, as you know, in with pieces of legislation, after they're enacted, there is some kind of a process for their commencement. Sometimes it's automatic, and the parts of legislation come into force automatically, but on other occasions it requires an order from the Secretary of State for an enacted piece of legislation to come into operation, and it's purely for administrative reasons, except for the fact that on this occasion the government have refused to commence it, having enacted it, and it remains on the statute book. They won't repeal it through Parliament democratically. It just remains sat on the statute book, and the government have said they are not yet prepared to commence it.
Do you think there's any reason for that at all?
Well, the reasons they've given have not stood up to any kind of scrutiny. What we do know is that the Secretary of State met with the editor of the Daily Mail less than a week before he announced that he was no longer minded to commence this provision. And there is, and more than that, we don't know the government's mind, especially after, as I say, the government introduced this measure and the Secretary of State himself voted for it when it went through Parliament.
He was chair of the Media and Sport Committee at the time.
That's right, yes. Yeah.
So a slightly more philosophical question to round us off.
Yeah.
On the issue of media power, do you think that they have the capacity to win elections, to influence the public, or is it in fact the case that politicians fear the media, thus giving them power?
Well, I don't really know, but it's clear that a lot of politicians do think that the media has a lot of power, and that's evident just from the number of meetings between members of this government and media executives and editors. Something Leveson recommended to deal with the issue of transparency in relationships between politicians and the media is that members of the cabinet and shadow cabinet should publish the subject of meetings that they have with media editors and executives, as well as the facts of the meeting after the event, and we've still not got there. The government do now publish the fact of meetings between members of the cabinet and the media, but still not the subject, and often they don't even publish the fact that it happened until up to 9 months after the meeting.
We've seen in recent months that John Whittingdale was exposed as having a relationship with a sex worker. Do you believe that this imposed on his decision to implement Section 40?
Well, the facts, the details of Mr. Whittingdale's private life are entirely his own, and we're always clear that there was no public interest in the fact that details of previous relationships that he may have had were published. There is public interest in the fact that he was aware that the press had a story about him that they would usually publish, but weren't publishing for some reason, and that he then went on to renege on elements of the cross-party agreement and the Leveson proposals that Cameron and the government had signed up for previously. We don't know whether the fact that Mr. Whittingdale knew that the press had a story about his private life has factored at all in his decision not to commence Section 40 of the Crime and Courts Act. But the fact that there is a possibility is extremely concerning. And what all of this highlights is simply that politicians shouldn't interfere in press regulation. And after the government signed up to the Leveson recommendations and led the enactment of Crime and Courts Act, and specifically the Leveson incentives that were a part of that, they should have taken a step back, and they should have let the independent process have taken its course, commenced Section 40 as was settled and agreed, and Mr. Whittingdale should not have intervened to suspend commencement of Section 40.
I think, yeah, you're completely right when you say that they would have published a story like that in the past. I mean, at the time they were fighting legal battles to uncover the celebrity threesome, as it was called. So I guess the final question I'd ask is, do you think that it's likely that Section 40 will pass under John Whittingdale whilst he's Culture Minister?
Well, I certainly think that the events of the past few months have raised a lot of concern, and I think that the only way, he just should never have intervened at all, and the only way he can now take a step back and sort of wash his hands of the issue of press regulation, which politicians ought to be doing, is to commence Section 40, be clear that Leveson Part 2 will happen, as has always been promised again by the government, and just take a step back and stop interfering.
So what's your message to David Cameron?
Well, my message would be simply the same message that has been that press abuse victims, Jerry and Kate McCann, and representatives from the Hillsborough Family Support Group and others have said to him twice now via letter, which is stick to your promises over press regulation, implement Leveson in full.
You heard that here, Mr. Cameron. Stick to your bloody promises. Thanks for coming to speak to us today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.